and start, Sarah, or would you like to wait a minute?
I am neutral, whatever you would like to do.
All right, looks like we have a couple more people joining.
Okay.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Eltantawi today and her lecture, Problems of Islamic Reform, Nigeria, Egypt, and the United States. Dr. Eltantawi received her PhD in the study of religion in 2012 from Harvard University, where she was the Jennifer W. Oppenheimer Fellow and Fellow at the Center for Public Leadership at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. An intellectual historian of contemporary Islam, Dr. I want to do the Arabic, is currently an associate professor of modern Islam at Fordham University. Her work focuses on Islamic law in the context of post-coloniality and authoritarianism, with a focus on Nigeria and Egypt. Dr. Eltantawi's book, Shari'ah on Trial, Northern Nigeria's Islamic Revolution, was published by the University of California Press in 2017. The book examines why Northern Nigerians took to the streets in 1999 to demand the re-implementation of Sharia law. Dr. Eltantawi is currently at work on other projects focusing on the political theology of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, situating their thought and political theory. Dr. Eltantawi is on the steering committee for the Contemporary Islam section of the American Academy of Religion and frequently comments in the international media on Islam and geopolitics. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for inviting me this afternoon. And I would really like to thank Professor Ellen McLarney for the wonderful invitation. I really appreciate it. And Julie Maxwell, the greatest, for all of her help and guidance. It is really an honor to be here. Our topic today is problems of Islamic reform in Egypt, Nigeria, and the United States. The first order of business is to clarify what reform means and to which audience. Two main connotations come to mind. One emerging from the Islamic tradition, al-tajdid al-dini, the notion that the religion is to be renewed for every generation. In the pre-modern period, this concept emerged from a hadith promising a mujaddid to appear once a century to revive the religion and the ummah. In the modern period, the 18th century's movements toward tajdeed were dominated by figures such as Shah Wali Allah in India and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the Arabian Peninsula. These two examples bring us to the first important note about this version of reform. It does not always proceed in a so-called liberal, or more accurately, expansive direction. The focus was on contraction away from bid'ah in these cases, or unlawful innovation. The 19th century and early part of the 20th century, however, saw mujaddids such as Muhammad Abdu, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, and Muhammad Iqbal attempt to expand the tradition to accommodate the scientific revolution, as well as the military and economic threat emerging from Europe. For these latter reformers, the way to oppose Western encroachment was to take what was valuable in the Islamic tradition, in the Western tradition, discover Islamic antecedents for them, and then foreground the result. I will begin by framing this debate by thinking through some of the critiques of how we approach Islam today with scholars Shahab Ahmed and Khalid Abu al-Fadl, who differ completely on the proper direction for Islamic reform. I will lay out the terms of their debate, with Ahmed representing what I call the expansionist camp, which can be thought of more as in the vein of the Al-Nahda reformers, and Abu al-Fadl representing the orthodox camp, which can be thought more in the classic Tajdid al-Dini camp. Then we will look at three contexts: a contestation between both camps in Egypt under the patronage of the military regime, an Islamic revolution for Sharia in northern Nigeria that took the form of an ill-fated power grab, and an opposite trend taking place in the United States, the progressive movement as an example of expansionist reform casting the widest possible net. The debate. To frame the problem, I present a debate of sorts between Islamic scholar Shahab Ahmed, who passed away in 2015, Allah yarhamu, and Islamic legal scholar and UCLA law professor Khalid Abou al-Fadl. Ahmed argues in his magnum opus, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, for an understanding of Islam that is informed as much by normative cultural tradition as it is by the Islamic legal tradition. Ahmed critiques the priority in modernity of what he calls Islam as law, the legal supremacist binding us to vast dimensions of understandings of Islam in different geographical nexuses, especially what he calls the Balkans to Bengal complex. These understandings and practices of Islam produce normative ethical frameworks and practices that are constituted through culture broadly understood. These normative frameworks are as Islamic as any other delimitation of the civilizational complex we call Islam. Khalid Abou al-Fadl forcefully rebuts Ahmed's project in an informal halaqah setting in Los Angeles in 2018. Abou al-Fadl argues that Ahmed's critique empties Islam of all content and commits intellectual malpractice in several respects. For the sake of argumentative clarity, I label Ahmed's conceptualization, again, the expansionist camp, and Abou al-Fadl's conceptualization, the orthodox camp. I would point out before delving in further the inherent limitations of presenting a debate between the text of a scholar who is no longer with us, Ahmed, and the oral spontaneous rebuttal of a scholar who is with us, Abou al-Fadl, but who has not addressed Ahmed's project in writing. Though Abou al-Fadl is articulate and exacting in his spontaneous oral comments, I grant that he might wish to clarify or elaborate in a more considered medium. As for Ahmed, it is of course a shame that he cannot rebut. And Shahab Ahmed writes, this totalizing legal supremacist conceptualization of Islam as law, whereby the essence of Islam is a phenomena of prescription and proscription, induces, indeed constrains us to think of Muslims as subjects who are defined and constituted by and in a cult of regulation, restriction, and control. As a matter of social analysis, it fails to come to terms with the human and historical phenomena adumbrated in Chapter 1, the pervasive historical fact of real societies in which Muslims who were very much in the social mainstream set up, valorized positively, celebrated, and lived by norms that were theoretical and practical, that were in theoretical and practical contradiction to the totalizing legal discourse that we are told here is the core and kernel of Islam. And when it comes to pass that scholars, laymen, and believers alike conceive of Islamic law as constitutive and consubstantive with normative Islam, then they are confronted with ideas and behaviors that are so positively valorized and widely practiced as to be normative, and that yet deviate from the legal norm. We find themselves at an analytical loss. It is important to read Ahmed carefully here. He does not quite argue that the Islamic legal tradition is a cult of regulation, restriction, and control. He argues that a conceptualization of Islam as law induces, indeed constrains us to think of Muslims as subjects who are constituted by this cult of regulation, restriction, and control. This distinction is important. According to Ahmed, if Islam is thought of as primarily a legal tradition, then this constrains us, and them, I would add, to think of Muslims precisely as members of a cult of regulation, constriction, and control. If we accept Ahmed's assertion here, then it is easy to see why Muslims and Islam would therefore be threatening to a liberal secular order. Turning to the Orthodox camp, Khalid Abul-Fadl objects in the strenuous manner one might expect of a legal scholar of his caliber to Ahmed's entire scholarly project. For Abul-Fadl, Ahmed empties Islam of orthodoxy and does so in a manner that does not stand up to scholarly scrutiny. For instance, Abul-Fadl is incredulous that Ahmed, in his quest to decenter the legal tradition and deconstruct received ideas of orthodoxy, cannot so much as recognize the 5 pillars, the Shahada, or even the Quran as constitutive of Islamic orthodoxy. So again, I'm going to quote Khalid Abul-Fadl's oral remarks that I transcribed from YouTube. So it's not a fair comparison, but he's, of course, Khalid Abul-Fadl and is saying brilliant things anyway. So bear with me on this. So he says, the other thing Shahab does is he goes to literature and he picks from literature. For example, the poetry of Abu Nawas. And he picks from the poetry of Abu Nawas descriptions of the joys of wine and alcohol, or accusations from some Sunni fanatics that Ali used to get drunk, or accusations from some Shia scholars that Abu Bakr used to get drunk. And he says, look, here, it must be that alcohol is as equally orthodox as no alcohol. That's good scholarship? You went to sectarian literature that was sectarian oriented, that was part of an intense conflict in which the political powers came in order that Ali be cursed from the minarets, or that Abu Bakr be cursed from whatever, and you co-opted that to justify your need for alcohol? What Shahab says is that, it is because Islamic law had an elitist privileged position throughout history, and there's no reason for it to have had that elitist privilege. That's a corruption of Islam. So when Allah says, فَجَعَلَ لَكُم مَنْهَجَّةً فَإِتْبَعْهُ, Allah says, we gave you a Shari'ah, we gave you a minhaj, so follow it. You read this and you say what Shahab says, well, we can argue, Muslims should get used to the fact that the Quran is not as authentic as they think it is. Even if it is authentic, it's not as relevant to their life as they think it is. In other words, it's outdated. That's not a scholarly position. That's an ideological position. That's your opinion because you don't like the Quran, because you lost your faith and you don't want to believe in the Quran anymore. That's your business, but don't present it as scholarship. Abul-Fadl argues that as a matter of social history, Amantul Ahmed claims, there is a serious error in believing that Muslims never agreed on anything. He criticizes Ahmed for holding up what he describes as marginal voices in the Islamic tradition and using those voices to disprove the existence of consensus. For Abul-Fadl, and as a basic position of any practicing Muslim, the Quran is the word of God and explains quite literally what Islam is. For Abul-Fadl, ascertaining the mainstream position of Muslims over centuries is correct scholarship, and holding up exceptions to the ideological rule as equal to the mainstream consensus is, quote, abusing historical texts. For Abul-Fadl, decentering the Quran and the mainstreamed ideological commitments of Orthodox Islam is a matter of losing faith, not a reconceptualization of what is Islam. Abul-Fadl makes another distinction as he lingers on the example of poetry of Abu Nawas. He asserts that poetry is a valid source for social history, that is to say, the discrete intellectual project of understanding what Muslims thought, said, and did in their societies, but it is not a valid source for theology. For Abul-Fadl, Ahmed's attempt to make it so is a product of his own confusion and desire to belong to a community that shares tenets he no longer believes in. These two scholars, and may I add post-colonial sons of Pakistan and Egypt writing in English, frame our problem of reform nicely. Is it tajdeed al-dini within established Orthodox legal frameworks as Abul-Fadl advocates, or does reform necessitate reaching outside the legal and theological tradition to rebuild it, as Shahab Ahmed suggests? The case of a recent debate between Al-Azhar scholars and the president of Cairo University in Egypt, one of Egypt's most poignant symbols of modernity, a debate that takes place under the patronage of the militarized state, gives a sense of how this debate plays out on the ground. Nigeria's case of an Islamist revolution that grabbed power by force shows us one extreme on the ground. While in the US, progressive movements whose agenda for Islamic reform can seem indistinguishable from boilerplate liberal ideals offers another. Turning to Egypt. In contemporary Egypt, the militarized state has of late undertaken a series of initiatives under the banner of Tajdid al-Fikr al-Dini, the renewal of religious thought, to organize the discourse around reform, Islamic reform, in a top-down manner. The players are President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who secured the blessing of Al-Azhar to totally oppress his Islamist opposition in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, who he now frames as a terrorist threat. A bit of history on Al-Azhar and the state. Al-Azhar is the main seat of Islamic learning in the Sunni world and the oldest university in the world. It was founded in 970 AD. In the modern period, Gamal Abdel Nasser introduced public education on secular topics, such as science and engineering, to Al-Azhar in the 1960s. The goal seemed to be to weaken the ulama and bring Azhar more in line with Nasserist political nationalist goals. Nasser's successor, Sadat, later faced a problem with this, as nationalism itself was a weakened discourse following the Naksa, or 1967 defeat to Israel. Though both strong men made concrete moves to co-opt and discipline Al-Azhar, it is important to note that the relationship between Al-Azhar and the state should not be thought of as one way, with the state exerting all authority over Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar's symbolic authority grants it significant soft power. As we see in the current administration of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, he has had to retract on a few proposals due to Azhar's objections. One example of this was Sisi's recent desire to abolish verbal divorce, whereby a man can immediately divorce his wife by pronouncing it 3 times. This effort was ultimately stymied by Al-Azhar. As powerful as Sisi is, he can ill afford to publicly run afoul of Al-Azhar, and there is evidence that on social issues, they are not quick to bend. This insight is in keeping with Lama Abu Orda's work on the post-colonial process of granting traditional Islamic authorities power over civil matters instead of capital or statecraft matters. Ahmed al-Tayyib, Al-Azhar's current Grand Sheikh, makes reference to this in the course of these debates around Islamic reform, when at one point he remarks, do you even think we are applying Islamic law outside of civil matters? I expected people to ask for more Islam, not less. This particular standoff and system of mutual constraints between Al-Azhar and the military regimes held through the Mubarak era, and as I suggested, is still operative under Sisi's regime. Earlier this year, at one of the main conferences under the auspices of Tajdid al-Fikr al-Dini, President of Cairo University, Professor Mohammed Uthman al-Kusht, remarked, "We're fighting the same battles as in the time of Caliph Uthman. So we are calling for the development of the Islamic sciences, not the revival of the Islamic sciences. لذلك نحن ندعو بتطوير علوم الدين وليست بإحياء علوم الدين." This is, of course, a very provocative statement, considering that Ihya Ulum ad-Din, which translates as the revival of religious knowledge, happens to be the title of Al-Ghazali's multi-volume 11th century masterwork, a pillar of traditional Islamic learning and debate. Sheikh al-Tayyib, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, responds to cheers and approving murmurs, "Sir, the Islamic heritage that is being derided today is what took a bunch of Arab tribes that used to fight each other and that couldn't tell right from left, and over the course of 80 years enabled them to place one foot in Al-Andalus and another in China. That is because they focused on the strong points of this heritage. How did the Islamic world advance before the French invasion of 1798? What set it in motion? Wasn't it the Shari'ah and the Islamic heritage, al-Turath al-Islami? Therefore, describing Islamic heritage as something that bequeathed weakness and backwardness is unfair to the Islamic heritage." If we step back and consider this scene, what we have is a conference organized by al-Sisi, the head of a military regime now ruling Egypt, who has undertaken the explicit task of reforming Islam. On one side is a powerful symbol of Egyptian modernity, Cairo University's president. Cairo University was founded in 1908 by luminaries of the Nahda movement against the wishes of British Vice-Regent Lord Cromer, who was loath to see Egyptian natives educated in the Western style. Cairo University admitted women as early as 1925, well before many American universities. The president of Cairo University is now calling for a, quote, interdisciplinary approach to Islamic reform, saying, "It is like saying I love and respect my father's house, but I don't want to live in it. It is time to build a new one." Sheikh al-Tayyib responds that this is unfair to the Islamic tradition that built an entire ummah before Napoleon arrived to Egypt's shores in 1798. Interestingly, though it is oft repeated that Al-Azhar is under the thumb of the military regime, if you asked me to guess, I would say Sisi sides with the president of Cairo University against Al-Azhar, while Al-Azhar seems to have prevailed in the debate. Meanwhile, another dynamic in the background is the systemic oppression of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose own approach to reform under the circumstances they found themselves in was first the Islamicization of public space, then contesting elections in a piecemeal manner, then winning the presidency of Egypt following a revolution mainly organized by non-revolutionary youth that they then neglected to ally with once in power. Given these dynamics of forced top-down maneuvering and outright oppression, it is tempting to say that these attempts at reform will have no effect, but I am not at all sure that history bears this conclusion out. It is possible that the Sisi era will see a kind of Islamic reform in Egypt, one piece of evidence being that the specter of Al-Azhar being challenged at all on an equal footing, no less, on national television by a well-respected symbol of Egyptian modernity in the form of Cairo University is unprecedented. I'll turn now to Nigeria. Nigeria offers us a different relationship between the Islamic reformers and post-colonial state. Nigeria was created in 1965, following almost 2 centuries of Western encroachment in the Hausaland region, beginning first economically, then politically, and then finally militarily. The south of the country was Christianized by British maritime colonization patterns in the south, bringing the English language and with that civil servant jobs to the southern region. The north, Islamic in different inflections since the 9th century, mainly through trade with North Africa and culminating with the Sokoto Caliphate, a caliphate of native sons that self-ruled and introduced the Maliki school of law to the region from 1809 to 1903, was disadvantaged by Western colonization in terms of language, access to high-paying jobs, and economic resources. Petrol is also in the south. A gentleman's agreement was reached between the north and the south. Nigeria would always have a Muslim military general as president in exchange for all of the privileges in the south. This agreement was disrupted in 1999 when Nigeria transitioned to democratic elections, which saw the election of the first Pentecostal Christian in Nigerian history, Olusegun Obasanjo. In the same year, hundreds of thousands of northern Muslims marched or took suddenly free taxis westward to declare the governor of Zamfara state, Ahmed Sani Yarima, a mujaddid, a renewer of the faith, for vowing to implement full Sharia law in the north. This was a demand from on the ground to governors who were all forced to quickly follow suit. People called for, quote, Sharia, and I use that word purposely to connote idealized Islamic law, not the hastily constructed, very reductionist fiqh that they ended up with. Fiqh being the man-made manifestation of the Sharia. The Sharia is an ideal that we could never know because we're not God. So all we can do is engage in fiqh. This attempt at reintroducing Sharia was ill-fated for several reasons. One, Nigeria is a federal system with an explicit line in the constitution granting freedom of religion. Though the North construed this to mean that they were free to implement Shari'ah, it's fair to say that the federal Supreme Court begged to differ. The only reason this experiment did not erupt into national scale violence is because President Olusojan very wisely said, if Sharia is from God, it will survive. If it is politics, it will fizzle out. And fizzle out it did. Because it was within a federal system, it was, as usual, just as impossible to hold the most corrupt and powerful among Nigerians to account. This shifted Sharia's focus to the weakest links in society, regulating the poor, regulating women, the uneducated. This did not endear Sharia's leaders to much of the population. Another point I would make here is that the implicit critique of the Nigerian state on the part of the Northern Muslim proponents of Sharia was more complicated than it looked. Though proponents of Sharia frequently derided the state as just a British colonial invention, 2 points should be made. One, they didn't say that as much when they were presidents of the country. Two, when I was in Nigeria, a funny thing happened. Libya's Gaddafi, who was alive at the time, and of course, a champion of Pan-Africanism, published an op-ed in one of Nigeria's most important newspapers calling on the country to split in two and for Northern Muslims to be independent. Exactly what the Sharia proponents were calling for. Much to my shock, these same Northerners were outraged. How dare this outsider come and try to divide Nigeria? Nigeria is indivisible. And Libya's ambassador was recalled, widely supported by the entire country. In Nigeria, Islamist reform in the North was above all a contestation over state power and post-colonial identity and legitimacy. It was a legitimate struggle for independence in a context that stymied the region's growth on multiple fronts, national, historical, and geopolitical. But insofar as replacing one corrupt power structure with another, one group of men with another, insofar as that was its main feature, its failure was a disaster for the region. This failure of this instantiation of Islamic reform inevitably led to the empowerment of much more radical manifestations. And today, the North is struggling with the nihilistic ravages of Boko Haram and other jihadi groups. Finally, I'll end with the American progressive Muslim case. The expansionist camp, I call it the net in the ocean. So the Progressive Muslim Union of North America, PMUNA, one of the first large-scale progressive Muslim organizations to be formed in North America, was inaugurated in New York City in 2004 and disbanded 2 years later. In full disclosure, I was one of the founders and am working on a history of that group. In 13 years since the dismantling of the Progressive Muslim Union, the political landscape for American Muslims has changed considerably. Islamophobia is much worse today, in my observation, than it was in 2006. At the same time, there is a great increase in visible Muslims in the American political sphere. Today, the conversation has shifted from a discussion over what Islam is to a more raw and elemental assertion of Muslim identity in political space, what I think of as identity politics Islam. We now have a president of the United States, Donald Trump, who has declared that, quote, he thinks Islam hates us. After PMU split, two former board members formed a group called the Muslims for Progressive Values, MPV, in 2007. On the organization's website, along with affirming gender justice, universal human rights, separation of church and state, and LGBTQI inclusion, it states, while we accept as Muslim anyone who identifies as such, the veracity and integrity of that claim is between the individual and God, and it is not a matter for the state nor an issue which other individuals can or should judge. We welcome all Muslim and non-Muslims who share our belief in a world where each person has value and deserves respect. There is no mention of Sharia. Instead, an invocation of universal human rights and Muslim identity is to be decided by any individual with no adjudication of those borders. MPV was in the news in July 2019 in connection with Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar. Ani Zonefeld, a founder of the Muslims for Progressive Values, at a conference for the Muslim Collective for Equitable Democracy in July of 2019 in Washington, D.C., asked Representative Omar and Representative Rashida Tlaib if they would make public statements condemning female genital mutilation. Omar was very upset by the question, calling it appalling, adding that she was quite disgusted, really, that as Muslim legislators, we are constantly being asked to waste our time speaking to issues that other people are not asked to speak to. Omar added, "Your second question is an appalling question because there are bills that we vote on, bills we sponsor, many statements we put out, and then we're on a panel like this and the question is posed, could you and Rashida do this? It's like, how often? Should I make a schedule? Does this need to be on repeat every 5 minutes? Should I be like, so today I forgot to condemn Al-Qaeda, so here's the Al-Qaeda one. Today I forgot to condemn FGM, so here it goes. Today I forgot to condemn Hamas, so here it goes." You know what I mean? Here, Omar assumes that she is being questioned about FGM because she is Muslim, not in her capacity as a congresswoman from a district in Minnesota with one of the highest percentages of FGM incidences in the United States. Mariam Saifi, a survivor of FGM, female genital mutilation, described Omar's failure to address the question as a, quote, missed opportunity to bring attention to this issue in a public forum. She said, I felt it was really important as a representative of a state where girls were affected by this particular case to use the opportunity as a way to elevate the issue. As a survivor, it really was really sort of hard. On one hand, I empathize that there are double standards and it's exhausting to condemn for the sake of condemning. But in this particular case, it was relevant and it was timely and it actually affected her constituents directly. I add my sympathies to the idea that it is exhausting to keep condemning issues. Indeed, this fatigue is largely in large part caused by and a consequence of the Islamophobia industry. However, Saifi's point that this issue directly affects the district Omar was elected to represent is significant. A consequence of the identitarian manifestation of American Islam in politics is that at the same time one can gesture toward any and all appeals to Muslim identity to have a voice in politics, as MPV does, conversely, one can also, as Omar does, refer to their status as a minority voice to pivot questions away from substantive discussions. Not only is theological substance lost in these identity politics, but the social issues and problematics that should make up the substance of the politics being contested in the first place. Activist Linda Sarsour performs this identitarian move repeatedly. In a 2018 appearance sponsored by the Council of American Islamic Relation, CARE, in Oklahoma, during a question and answer session, a questioner asked her what Sharia law is and why Sarsour thinks people are afraid of it. This is her answer to the question. So, and again, it's oral, so I just transcribing. This is not her writing a thought out written, exposition. So first, Sharia law, Sharia means law. When we say Sharia law, you're saying law. But anyway, so I actually got caught in a controversy about this, which is why I am happy to answer the question. 8 years ago, when the Oklahoma State Legislature was trying to ban Sharia, this really monstrous thing, I was in New York City and we had a social media campaign that was trying to basically explain what Sharia was. So I got into controversy at the Women's March because these trolls went back 8 years ago and pulled out tweets out of context and sequence because that's what they do. And I don't care, that's fine. I still stand by all the tweets that I put out. But anyway, what's important to understand about Sharia is that Sharia basically is the pathway for Muslims to live out their lives, right? So it's very similar to halakha, for those that are Jews, and similar to canon law. The interesting thing is that the Islamophobia industry in this country has been really good for the past 16 years in trying to define what Sharia is. So how do people figure out what Sharia is? They go online, they Google an image, an infographic shows up and it tells you Sharia law is stoning women. Sharia law is all these really bad, horrible things, right? It's ahistorical. It takes things and quotes from the Quran out of context. And in fact, as someone who has a doctorate in Islamic studies, and then she gestures to someone next to her, we can say that the same thing about Sharia as we say about the Bible. Like things that are found in the Torah or the Bible or the Quran, it's pretty similar. But this constant obsession with Islam is what really bothers me. So Sharia is a very simple thing. It's the way that we get married. It's the way we divide inheritance. When people in our family pass away, it's how we arbitrate our divorces, things like that. It's about praying 5 times a day. It's about fasting 30 days. It's about all kinds of almost rules and regulations of how it's like to be a Muslim. Not everybody follows all of them, but the point is, that's what it is. This is an interesting approach to the question about Sharia that is at the center of the Islamophobia industry. It is important to note that Sharia does not mean law. Sharia is the way or the path. It is God's law and it is an ideal. And because we are not God, we can only ever strive to uncover the Sharia. The human attempt to uncover the law is called fiqh, the proper translation for Islamic law. The fiqh has several legal schools that are all very detailed on a wide variety of issues. This is important because when Sharia law, quote, is established in post-modernity, a feature of that process is vastly reduced legal codes, such as in Nigeria, that borrow in a patchwork manner from the fiqh and also from primary sources such as the Quran and the Sunnah. It's a hodgepodge that's sort of a postmodern Frankenstein, if you will. Hence, it is important to really understand and communicate to the American public what it might look like to introduce parts of the Sharia into the American legal system. Fiqh encompasses far more than prayer and inheritance. In my view, there is no real way that these systems could be compatible, but for very narrow appeals to family law. And these would need to proceed as they do now in special arbitration courts. Sarsour is correct that there are similarities to halakha, but not to canon law. And as such, one could note the extensive debate about Jewish law versus American law among Jewish feminists who, by and large, oppose Jewish law in American courts. Sarsour then pivots away to a story of how she was trolled on social media to point out that it is Islamophobes who are attempting to define what the Sharia is rather than Muslims. To the extent that this is true, this debate is staying very close to the surface. It is not about what Sharia really is, or even what the Islamophobes are actually saying about Sharia. The conversation is stopped at who has the right to speak about this topic in the first place. That the answer to this question for Sarsour is to be determined solely on the basis of identity is made clear in her next set of comments. She discusses the word jihad as another example of a, quote, scary word used by Islamophobes to malign Muslims. She describes how the word means struggle and tells a story of a public event where she recalls the Prophet Muhammad, in which he's represented to have said that the best form of jihad is speaking out against an unjust ruler. Okay, and then she goes on to talk about how she employed that with Trump. But my point being that these extremely complex discussions about what Sharia is, what fiqh is, and how it manifests in the world are reduced to strictly a conversation about who's allowed to talk about this. The answer is Muslims. The more specific answer is visible Muslims. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up because I suspect I'm running out of time. So in thinking about this, I think back to Shahab's theory of what is Islam, which I believe in general has a great deal of analytic merit. And it is an important reconceptualization of how one grasps the history and theological development of this civilizational complex we call Islam. This is why I am quite surprised to find myself in significant moments of pause when observing the way this expansionist understanding of Islam manifests itself in the American political sphere today. My main concern is that the collision of identity politics with liberalism is producing an extremely hollow Islam that can be easily infiltrated. There are aspects of the Muslim progressive camp for whom the ethical values they advocate for are virtually indistinguishable from mainstream American liberal ideals. This conjures an image of a net wafting through the ocean, peaceful, going with the flow of the waves, but adding nothing and catching nothing in the process, and perhaps losing whatever is caught up in the net. If one can be so bold as to hypothesize that political Islamic movements are another side of the same identitarian coin, all identity, little substance, political Islamic trends can simply substitute identitarian markers of Islam, such as beards, hijabs, or modes of dress, for Islam itself, which creates a kind of ideological and bodily conformity that can easily be exploited by authoritarian political forces, locking them into seemingly eternal strife, as they are in Egypt. In conclusion, our three examples today are all embedded in specific contexts that make drawing grand synthesizing conclusions about reform with a capital R seem facile. But let me make modest observations. Islamist attempts at reform that emerge from bottom up and clash with the state seem to produce intractable conflict in every context I have looked at. On the other hand, net in the ocean expansionist progressive camps that do not engage the tradition at all, reducing it to a new identity to add to ongoing liberal discourses, raises the ire of the traditionalists and causes them to double down in their own identitarian way on Islamic law. Traditionalist schools of learning, such as Al-Azhar, under the thumb of a militarized state, teetering between co-opting them and feeling threatened by them, similarly double down against forces of modernity, such as that coming from Cairo University, who also labor under the restrictions of the militarized state. This offers a bleak picture. I will tell you where my money is for organic Islamic reform, such as it is. In Egypt, it is on traditional Egyptian Islam, what anthropologist Nouri Yalman calls soft Islam, and what Layla Ahmed calls women's Islam, namely that capacity of that deeply rooted civilization to seamlessly synchronize received Islam with what Heidegger describes as our condition of being thrown into the world. This is much like Shahab Ahmed's masterful conception of how Islamic history actually really works. In Nigeria, I have the same hopes, with the specific addition that in that very rich, multifaceted society, for the Islamic North, the proud legacy of the Sokoto Caliphate offers an enduring model and memory of self-rule and creates deep culture that will be sustaining. In the US, I'll make my most postmodern statement yet and argue that it is conversations like this one in which we stand back to understand what is really going on without getting too identified with our positions that will allow for the most flexibility and growth. Thank you.
That was an incredibly rich and nuanced and extensive discussion. I feel like I'm still processing all of the ideas. I would like to open it up now to any questions that anyone wants to ask.